Everyone who spends time on the coast needs to have a good understanding of tides, especially us anglers. The size, state and timing of the tide affects a wide variety of elements, from influencing the movement of fish and the times at which they feed to determining whether venues are safe to access and able to be fished effectively. If you are relatively new to sea angling, broadening your understanding of tides is one of the key things that is likely to instantly put more fish on the beach for you. So that's what we're going to look at in this video. So let's start with the basic terminology. High tide is a time at which the tide is at its highest point, and low tide is a time at which it's at its lowest. The size of the tide can be read from tide charts or tide curves. Investing in a book showing tide data for your local area is a good idea. On a typical tide table, the time of high and low tide is displayed along with the height of the sea in metres. This height is measured from the lowest astronomical low tide as a reference point. So if the low tide on a particular day is shown at 2.5 metres, this is 2.5 metres above the lowest predicted low tide in your area. If the high tide is, say, 7.2 metres, it would be normal for you to hear other anglers refer to this as the size of the tide, although this is only the height that the tide achieves above the lowest possible low tide, and not the size of the tide cycle as a whole, as it started at 2.5 metres in the first place. In the UK, there are typically 2 high tides and 2 low tides in a 24-hour period, with approximately 6 hours from high to low and vice versa. When the tide is moving in from low to high, this is typically referred to as the flood or the push. And when it is going from high to low, this is referred to as the ebb or the drop. When the tide reaches its highest or lowest point, there is a period of time before the tide reverses direction. During this period there is little to no movement, and for this reason it's termed slack water. The difference in the height of the sea between high and low is called the tidal range. The tidal range changes from day to day as the tides build towards springs and fall towards neaps. Springs are the tides with the highest highs and the lowest lows, and neaps are the exact opposite, tides with the smallest tidal range. The cycle of springs and neaps takes place over approximately 2 weeks. The range of the largest spring tide is determined by the time of year, whether the moon is a full moon or a new moon. In the UK, new moon springs will have a larger range than full moon springs in the winter and spring, whereas in the summer and autumn the reverse is the case, with the biggest tide ranges of the year found around the month of September. In some parts of the UK, the tide cycle takes a different form. At Southampton, for example, there is a double high tide, an effect which is particularly pronounced on spring tides. After the flooding tide peaks over the first high, there is a slight drop before the tide slackens again over a second, slightly smaller high tide. This phenomenon is caused by the complex tidal dynamics of the English Channel, most notably the fact that the tide is in opposite states at its eastern and western extremities. So when it's high water in Dover, it's low water in Land's End. The full flood and double high tide part of the cycle at Southampton takes approximately 9 hours, meaning that the tide has less time to ebb to low water, approximately 3.5 hours, producing an ebb tide that is significantly stronger than the flood. It is important to understand that the times of high and low tide can vary significantly between regions, even between places not geographically that far apart. This is because there is far more at play in the inshore environment than the straightforward rising and falling of the sea. Coastal geography dramatically impacts the movement of water. Good examples of this can be found at some beaches and rock marks inside large bays, where the tidal current flows in the same direction on both flood and ebb tides, or estuaries where sandbanks around the mouth of the system obstruct the flooding tide. Therefore, whenever you fish somewhere new, it's important to check the tide times for that specific area and not assume that it will be similar to somewhere close that you are more familiar with. It is also important to understand that the velocity of the flooding and ebbing tides are not constant. The flow of a tide cycle as depicted on a graph is most typically seen as a sine wave-like curve. From this curve you can see that the tide builds velocity on the early part of the flood and gradually slows towards the high tide, and vice versa on the ebb. Most importantly, these changes in tidal velocity greatly influence the movement and feeding behaviour of fish, and therefore your fishing opportunities. For example, those periods of time when the current builds or slows before or after peak run can be excellent times to catch plaice, while slack water can be a good time to catch conger eels. In estuaries, the flooding tide will trigger fish like bass, mullet and gilthead bream to travel deeper into the systems. Understanding how the states of tides and the velocity of the flow work to influence the likelihood of feeding fish being present at your chosen venue is key to consistent catches. As we have already seen with the example of Southampton, however, the flow of flood and ebb tide does not always follow the classic sine wave-like pattern when plotted on a graph. And the chances are that the tidal cycles will vary between areas that you encounter. It's always a good idea to check tide curves before your fishing sessions. This will help you to predict when the times are optimum to expect to encounter your target species. As well as local coastal dynamics, as tides are predicted under average meteorological conditions, more extreme conditions can have a dramatic effect on tides. For example, high pressure can produce high and low tides that are lower than predicted, and low pressure can result in tides that are higher than chart predictions. Wind conditions will further amplify these effects so that a strong onshore wind will produce a higher high and low tide, whereas a strong offshore wind will result in a lower high and low tide than predicted. These factors are important to bear in mind, not least for your safety, as well as the fishing.